The Elizabethan Curriculum, Classical Education for the Modern Man. Lecture 23, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, The Cost of the Infinite. Antony and Cleopatra was written probably around 1606 or 1607, 7 or 8 years after Julius Caesar, and the distance between the two plays is not merely chronological. Julius Caesar is a play of containment, of classical restraint, of architecture. Antony and Cleopatra is a play that deliberately overwhelms its own architecture, that keeps breaking the forms that Julius Caesar respected, that is structurally excessive in ways that mirror its subject. It has 42 scenes. It moves between Rome and Egypt and Greece and Syria and back again with a restlessness that no other Shakespeare play matches. It contains some of the most extravagant poetry in the language and some of the most deflating prose, sometimes within the same scene. It is, in the most precise sense, a play about excess, and it achieves that subject by being excessive. The source is again Plutarch, The Life of Antony, which we discussed in Lecture 18, and Shakespeare follows it with the same close fidelity he brought to Julius Caesar. But what he does with it is different. Julius Caesar is a play about public life, about politics, about the forum and the Senate and the battle. Antony and Cleopatra is a play about the relationship between public life and private life, about what happens when the two come into irreconcilable conflict, about the cost of choosing one over the other and the impossibility of having both. Antony at the opening of the play is already the diminished figure that Plutarch shows us in the years after Cleopatra. He knows he is diminished. The play opens with 2 of his Roman officers watching him, and one of them says that his captain's heart has become the bellows and the fan to cool a gypsy's lust. This is not Antony's enemies speaking. This is his own officers, men who admire him and are watching him waste himself. And the word they use, waste, is the play's central word. Antony is wasting himself on Egypt, which from Rome's perspective means he is wasting himself on pleasure and passion and the particular world that Cleopatra represents, a world of infinite sensation and infinite possibility and infinite present tense, with no thought for the future that Rome is always building toward. Rome in this play is everything that Egypt is not. Rome is duty, measurement, calculation, the subordination of the present to the future, the management of desire in the service of power. Egypt is sensation, excess, the infinite present, the refusal to calculate, the preference for the magnificent gesture over the prudent one. Neither is presented as simply superior to the other, which is the play's central achievement and its central difficulty. Rome produces Octavian, who is going to win and who is going to build an empire that lasts 5 centuries. Egypt produces the feast on Cleopatra's barge and the infinite variety that age cannot wither nor custom stale, which is going to be remembered as long as the language survives. The play holds both of these things simultaneously and refuses to adjudicate between them. Enobarbus is the character who holds the balance. He is Antony's most loyal officer and his most honest observer, the man who loves him and watches him clearly and eventually, in one of the most painful scenes in the play, cannot follow him further. His description of Cleopatra's arrival at Tarsus, the speech that begins the barge she sat in like a burnished throne, is the play's most celebrated passage, and it is worth pausing on because it demonstrates exactly what Shakespeare is doing at his most technically accomplished. The speech is drawn almost directly from North's Plutarch. Shakespeare has taken North's prose description and turned it into verse, which sounds like a simple operation and is in fact an act of transformation as radical as anything in the Metamorphoses. North's prose gives you the facts of the scene: the gilded barge, the purple sails, the burning perfumes, the boys like painted cupids, Cleopatra under the canopy dressed as Venus. Shakespeare's verse gives you something else entirely. It gives you the effect of the scene on the man watching it. The sense that what is being described is not merely spectacular, but literally supernatural. That Cleopatra has not dressed as Venus, but somehow become something that the word Venus is inadequate to contain. Winds were lovesick with her. The water which she beat followed faster, as amorous of their strokes. The city cast her people out upon her, and Antony, enthroned in the marketplace, did sit alone, whistling to the air. That last image is the stroke of genius that Shakespeare adds to Plutarch. Antony, sitting alone in the marketplace, whistling to the air, because everyone in the city has gone to the river to see her, is both comic and devastating. the most powerful man in the Eastern Mediterranean, left alone in a public space because a woman has drawn the entire city away from him, not by force, but by sheer presence. He has already lost. He does not know it yet, will not know it for years. But in this image, Shakespeare has already told you how the play ends. Cleopatra herself is the most complex female character Shakespeare ever created, and the one most dependent on the classical education that the course has been building. She cannot be understood without Ovid, whose women are never simply what they appear to be, and whose transformations are always also psychological. She cannot be understood without Plutarch, whose account of her intelligence and her political calculation Shakespeare follows exactly. It cannot be understood without Virgil's Dido, whose passion for Aeneas and whose abandonment by him she consciously echoes and deliberately inverts. Where Dido was abandoned and destroyed, Cleopatra abandons first, manages the dynamic, and transforms even her own death into a performance of such magnificent control that it defeats Octavian's intention of parading her in his triumph more completely than any military victory could have done. The Rome of this play is Octavian's Rome, which is to say Augustus's Rome, and Shakespeare's Octavian is one of his most interesting minor characters precisely because he is not interesting in any conventional dramatic sense. He is cold, precise, politically infallible, and personally rather unpleasant. He wins completely and permanently. His victory being the Augustan settlement that we discussed in the Constitutional History lecture, the most successful political construction in the ancient world. And yet the play does not feel like his play. It feels like Antony's and Cleopatra's play, which means it feels like the loser's play, which is itself a statement about what endures. Antony and Cleopatra built the myth. The empire lasted 5 centuries in the West. The myth has lasted 2,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. This is the Ovidian paradox the play is built on. Ovid, in the last lines of the Metamorphoses, claimed that his poem would outlast the empire. He was right. Shakespeare is making the same claim on behalf of Antony and Cleopatra. The people who lose magnificently outlast the people who win efficiently, because magnificence generates story, and story generates the kind of immortality that political success cannot produce. Augustus is a historical figure. Antony and Cleopatra are a myth. Myths are considerably harder to kill than empires. The death scenes with which the play ends are the most extended and the most deliberately theatrical deaths in Shakespeare, which in a playwright who understood theatrical death as well as any writer who has ever lived is saying a great deal. Antony's death is botched and human and moving, following Plutarch's account with the same fidelity we noted in Lecture 18. He falls on his sword and fails to die immediately. He is hoisted up to Cleopatra's monument by ropes, dies in her arms, giving her advice about whom to trust, which under the circumstances is almost comic, and which Shakespeare knows is almost comic, because the almost comedy is the truth of the moment. People do not die with perfect dignity. They die giving unnecessary advice. Cleopatra's death is the opposite. She prepares herself with deliberate ceremony. She dresses in her royal robes. She calls for her crown. She takes the asp, if asp it was, with a composure that is both genuinely heroic and genuinely theatrical, which in Cleopatra amounts to the same thing. Her last words, addressing the asp as a baby at her breast, as a lover's pinch which hurts and is desired, are among the most disturbing and most beautiful lines in the play, combining the erotic and the maternal and the mortal in a way that no other writer has quite managed before or since. And Octavian, arriving too late to prevent it, looks at the dead queen and says she looks like sleep, as she would catch another Antony in her strong toil of grace. It is the most generous thing he says in the entire play, and it is said over her dead body, which is the only position from which he could afford to be generous. She is no longer a political problem. She is a myth. He can afford to acknowledge the myth now that the problem is resolved. The play ends with Octavian ordering a great solemnity of burial for Antony and Cleopatra together. No grave upon the earth shall clip in it a pair so famous. He is doing what Augustus did throughout his political career, which is to consecrate in public ceremony the reality that his power has created. The lovers are dead. The myth is officially sanctioned. Everyone has what they wanted, including the audience, which has been given one of the greatest plays in the language by a playwright who could not have written it without Plutarch. without Ovid, without Virgil, and without the entire classical education that this course has been reconstructing. In our next lecture, we take the darkest of Shakespeare's Roman plays, Coriolanus, which is also the most politically uncomfortable and the most directly relevant to the question of what happens when a man of absolute virtue and absolute rigidity meets a political world that requires flexibility above all else. It is the play that audiences have always found most difficult and scholars have always found most interesting, which is itself a recommendation. End of lecture 23.